Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come to your Rotary meeting. I always half joke that I should just become a Rotarian, because somewhere in the province I'm talking to the Rotary Club. I bring you greetings from the Lethbridge Rotary Club, where I was speaking on Monday at noon. So it's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. The title of my presentation in the time that I've got allotted here, Alberta Economy Fall 2012, and I could maybe tack onto that now, 2013, since we've only got, well, about a month left of 2012. Strange days indeed. Probably if you're like most of us and you look at you watch the economic news on TV or you pick up the business pages, you'd probably agree that there are a lot of very strange things going on in the global economy. And it's really not your imagination. I would hazard to say that 2012 has been marked by more sort of anxious and unsettling news about the global economy. A lot unknown, what's going to happen next. And a lot really does hang in the balance. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about some of these global economic situations. I'll talk about the US economy. I'll talk about the broader Canadian economy, and then I'll focus it in on what this province is experiencing and where I see things going in 2013. But before I get to all of that heavy lifting, talking about the global economy, I do want to tell you one little story, an experience I had. About 3 months ago, I found myself with 3 other friends. We were in a restaurant. I'm not going to tell you what city it was in. Suffice to say, it was not in Alberta. I just don't want the story to reflect poorly on this city. But we found ourselves on holidays in this restaurant. It was a tapas-style restaurant. Very popular place. Hard actually to get a table in there. But everything was small and tapas style, meant to be eaten with your hands. The food started coming out and it was all pretty good. These are the veggie pakoras that came out. You can see mine is already missing from the plate. They were delicious. The next dish that came out was these. This was the Korean barbecue chicken bites. They were really, really good. And again, mine has been gobbled up. Now, keep your eye on that little wooden pick in the chicken bite, because the wooden pick comes back in a little while in the story in a starring role. But you can get the sense of the type of food. Everything was just small bite-sized bits, and everything was really delicious. We were having a great time until this came out. Now this was the feature of the evening. It was a little barbecue, or a little cheeseburger slider, they called it. Just kind of a mini hamburger. And it looked really great, and the 4 of us were ready to tuck into it. The problem was we didn't have any cutlery to cut it. So we flagged down our hostess and our server, and we asked what we thought was a very reasonable question: could we get some cutlery? And she said, "I'm sorry, there is no cutlery at this restaurant." And at that point, we felt a bit like being on those Monty Python sketches, you know? You remember the finest cheese shop in all of England, but I'm sorry, we have no cheese. Well, this restaurant had no cutlery. So we thought, well, that's a bit strange, but then we asked her, would you mind just running into the kitchen and getting us a knife? We know you've got knives in that kitchen somewhere. Can you just bring us a knife? We just want to cut our little slider into 4. And she says, "I'm sorry, I can't do that for you. But I will send out the owner and the executive chef." So we were really kind of puzzled by this whole situation. In fact, we were so confused, it didn't even occur to us to be angry yet. But presently, a nice young man came out. He couldn't have been 30 years old. He was the owner of the restaurant, and he was very pleasant, and he said, "It's my vision in this restaurant that there not be any cutlery kind of messying up the tables. Everything is tapas-style food. It's meant to be eaten with your hands." And we said, well, we can kind of get that. In fact, that's sort of charming in a way. But it still leaves us with this problem. We'd like to cut our little burger. We don't want to pass it around mouth to mouth. We weren't that kind of friends. So we asked him, well, would you mind just taking the little cheeseburger slider back into the kitchen and having your chefs cut it? How hard could that be? And he says, no, I won't do that either. Can you imagine how busy our kitchen would be if we had to cut everybody's food? You know, we thought, well, we're more than capable of cutting our own food. We just don't have a knife. You know, but he wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to bring us a knife. He wasn't going to allow his chefs to cut it. He basically turned and walked away. So we were so confused. However, we were resourceful, and we used the one thing we had, and that was the little wooden pick. We had the presence of mind to save a wooden pick from the chicken, and we were able to use this little wooden stick as a crude cutting device. And we were able to manage, we managed to get the hamburger into 4 roughly equal parts. And I got to tell you, the slider was really tasty. Now you're probably wondering, okay, what does any story have to do with the global economy? Well, there's probably all kinds of lessons about customer service in this story. That might be a different presentation. But what I want to do is draw three parallels from this story to describe the problem that the global economy is having, particularly the problem central banks are having at the moment. And this is a key problem that is preventing the economy, the global economy, from getting going. The first parallel, or the first comparison I want to make is, this is a knife, a very common, very handy tool. It works great, but this is the tool we were lacking at that restaurant. If we had this tool, I wouldn't have a story. Our little cheeseburger would have been cut. In the same respect, the central banks are lacking their main policy tool, and that is cuts to interest rates. And you guys are a smart crowd. You know how this works. If the economy is sputtering out, central banks, they rush to the rescue. They reduce interest rates. People start borrowing again, and the economy generally revives. It works very well most of the time. But right now, in 2012, most central banks don't have any more interest rates left to cut. So they find themselves lacking their main policy tool, and it is causing a real problem for these central banks. Well, the second parallel I want to talk about is improvising. We improvised with the little wooden pick. The wooden pick was not the ultimate tool. It was a blunt tool. It eventually worked for us, but it was not the ideal tool that we'd like to have. Central banks are using a less perfect tool, and that is what we now refer to as quantitative easing. And you've probably heard a lot about that. In Canada, we have not yet had to engage in any quantitative easing. But quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, all of these banks have engaged in basically, the basic idea is injecting more cash into your economy. Basically printing money, although not physical bills, but injecting more money into the economy with hopes that this encourages people to start spending, keeps long-term interest rates low. The Fed, they're into their third round already of quantitative easing, and this third round, unlike the first two, which were just big bombs of cash dropped, this third round is more the intravenous drip, about $40 billion worth of cash every month, and the Fed said, we're just going to keep doing this as long as we need to keep doing it. The question on all the economists' minds, though, is any of this quantitative easing working? Or, in fact, might it do more harm in the long run? Those traditional economic textbooks, they tell us, if you just start printing money, you're going to cause inflation. And normally, that is what we've seen. At the moment, in the U.S., there's not a whiff of inflation. In fact, they're still closer to deflation than inflation. But critics of quantitative easing would say, well, look, they've been doing this for 4 years. The U.S. economy is not operating at close to potential. Clearly, it's a failure, and they should stop doing it. However, another perspective would be to say, well, hold on. Remember, around 4 years ago, right around this time of year, October, November, December of 2008, you remember what that was like? Everything was just sliding into the abyss. And there was a real fear that the U.S. economy was, in fact, going to collapse. And we didn't know how deep this was going to go. Well, a proponent of quantitative easing could say, well, if it wasn't for those rounds of quantitative easing, perhaps the U.S. and global economy would be in worse shape today. Maybe it did prevent a death spiral and the financial systems from collapsing. We'll never know for sure. You can never go back in economics and repeat the experiment again. It's not like chemistry or those easier sciences. It will be left up to conjecture and economic debates if quantitative easing is the appropriate measure or not. But whatever, people, however you look at it, the Federal Reserve has been clear, we're going to keep doing this. So 2013 will be an interesting year to watch. The third parallel I want to draw about between my hamburger story and the global economy, this is what we were experiencing a lot of non-cooperation in the restaurant. We had a lot of people with different opinions or different viewpoints about what was going to happen there that night. We had a server who was not going to bring us a knife. In fact, you got the feeling the poor gal was probably going to be fired if she brought us a knife. And you could tell by the rolling of her eyes, she's been through this before. She's probably been asked 5 times that night already, could we get some cutlery? But she wasn't going to help us. We had the executive chef. He wasn't going to participate in our cutting experiments. He said, my vision is that everything be eaten with your hands. So we had these conflicting viewpoints. And the global economy right now, one of the big factors holding it back is competing viewpoints, different opinions about what needs to be done to solve some of these problems. Think about Europe, arguably the continent in the worst shape at the moment. And the reasons for their recession, the Mediterranean countries, or at least a lot of them, the bigger ones, at least Spain, Greece, they have amassed so much debt and are running such high deficits that they're teetering on insolvency. Now there's different perspectives. How do we deal with this? Germany, along with the Troika, they call them, the IMF and the European Central Bank and the European Commission, those viewpoints say, well, it's got to be austerity. You Mediterranean countries, you've got to cut and cut and cut your government spending. You've got to cut it to the bone. And that's the only way you're going to get out of this, gradually moving your budgets closer to something resembling balance. Well, the Mediterranean countries, they have a different viewpoint. They're like, well, we don't like austerity. You know, it's not very fun. They're rioting in the streets. They're burning the cities. And you know, I have no doubt that that kind of level of austerity would not be pleasant. But the Mediterranean countries, they have a different solution. They want a growth policy. They want, in fact, even more borrowing and spending to try to get their economy growing again and broaden the tax base that way. Well, a reasonable person could sort of conclude, well, it's got to be a combination of both. It's got to be credible austerity and some belt-tightening and some growth policies. But you're seeing a lot of hard lines being drawn in the sand politically. There are some signs that, you know, some leaders are willing to compromise a bit, be a little bit more patient with the austerity. But just the other week, was at the end of last week, the 17 finance ministers from the Euro countries were together in a meeting, and the meeting broke down and everyone left because they can't come to any agreements on this. This is exactly what the global economy does not need at the moment, is people walking out of meetings. Think about our friends to the south. They've got a real dilemma on their hands. Apparently I'm prohibited from describing it and using the word, maybe I'll call it the financial edge or something like that. I'll have to pay a sad buck if I say what we normally call it, but you know, they've got some real choices ahead of them. They've got some decisions and some compromise to make. You've got the Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of them, especially the Republicans, you know, they took this very seriously. A lot of them have signed pledges saying, I'll go to Washington and I'm going to sign this pledge, vowing I will never vote for a bill that increases taxes in any way. You know, they weren't kidding. They might have been wrong-headed, but they were not joking when they signed this pledge. And now they find themselves in a very uncomfortable situation because they either have to go against their pledge and save the economy, or they keep their pledge and risk, in fact, throwing the U.S. back into a recession. So, depending on which day of the week, yesterday it looked like, oh, you know, the talks among the lawmakers in the U.S. weren't going very well. Today it sounds like it's going a little better. I think level heads will prevail. I think they will arrive at some consensus. But they better hurry up because they've only got about 4 weeks left. On the topic of the U.S. economy, how is our neighbor to the south doing? Well, what the best you can say for the poor U.S. economy right now is that it's treading water. You know, treading water is better than your nose 10 feet under the waves. But they're also not getting anywhere. They're not progressing. They're just kind of stagnating. The main problem with the U.S. economy is still in the labor market. Still far too many people unemployed. And that 8% unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, that masks all the underemployment. Millions of Americans who are working, but they're only maybe working part-time. Or maybe they're working in jobs that don't make adequate use of their skills or experience. You know, the engineer delivering pizza. He's got a job, but he's underemployed. And this is a real problem for the U.S. The presidential election that is now behind us, well, during the campaign, you heard both of the candidates talk a lot about, well, we're going to create, you know, our goal is we're going to create 1 million jobs. But there was scant detail from either of the two how exactly you expect that to happen. You know, they don't just spontaneously return. And maybe you can have some sympathy because there is no magic wand you can wave and create that many jobs. I think it might still be a bit of a slog over the next year or a couple of years, in fact, before the American economy starts churning out enough jobs to get that unemployment rate down. But the bright news in the U.S. economy, and there is bright news, is in the housing market. Now you might remember back in around 2006, 2007, it was the housing market that kicked off all the fun with the global downturn and mortgages collapsing and precipitating the global recession when those prices started to tip and then they started to plunge. And it's been 4 years of very, very slow, very gradual improvements in the housing market. But the last 6 or 7 months, perhaps, we're starting to see a little bit of traction being gained. Housing prices in most markets, not everyone, but most markets in the U.S., housing prices are rising again, and they're showing consistent increases. And housing starts are showing consistent increases. That's a really, really good sign. And it's a good sign because once your housing price starts to rise, even if you're not affected, even if you're still working, but if the value of your house went from $500,000 to $210,000, you are automatically going to feel less wealthy. Well, in fact, you are less wealthy, and you're automatically going to start to, spend less and feel a little bit nervous about your consumption. If those housing prices now are starting to claw their way back up, you'll naturally start to feel a little bit more confident. And if that happens, we'll see consumers spending a little bit more. And once consumers start spending, then finally what everyone's been waiting for is for corporate America, that business investment end of it. Then they'll start spending because corporations will be a little bit more confident that, well, there'll be some consumers around to buy the goods that we're producing. So it will be the housing market that we have to watch for, and I'm hopeful that if the U.S. government is able to avoid their, what do they call it, the financial edge, and if in fact the housing market continues to claw its way back, that 2013 will be a better year for the U.S. economy. Okay, where does this leave us here in Canada? Well, the broader Canadian economy, it too, like the U.S., it's kind of treading water. We're going to find out tomorrow morning from Statistics Canada. They will release the GDP growth for the third quarter of 2012. It's likely to come in pretty soft, maybe around 1.5%. And if it's 1.5%, that's only about halfway, half the growth. That 3% is what the Bank of Canada would consider potential growth rate for the Canadian economy. That's kind of where you want it. At 1.5%, we're obviously a little short of that potential growth rate. Most of the softness in the Canadian economy is, of course, focused in central Canada, Ontario and Quebec particularly. And that is the manufacturing heartland of Canada. They are struggling not only with that high Canadian dollar, but also the fact that their main export customer, the United States, is struggling. However, in Western Canada, we're doing much better. In fact, if it wasn't for, especially the prairie region, if it wasn't for the prairies, that Canadian growth rate might not be 1.5%, it might be closer to 0 or maybe 0.5%. Western Canada is still the engine of Canada's economy, and in Alberta, it's all about this commodity, oil. Energy is still the dog that wags the tail, or at least most of the tails in this province, either direct or indirectly. A lot of the economy, obviously, is driven by energy. Natural gas has not been a driver for a few years already. But better news on the oil and bitumen side. At the moment, though, those prices are actually not really that strong. We follow, the newspapers will track and they'll report in the news what that West Texas Intermediate crude number is, the U.S. benchmark price. And all these prices kind of move together. But it's always that WTI price that we hear quoted. And at the moment, that price is about US $87, $88 a barrel. It sounds actually pretty good. But in fact, that price is quite soft. It's about $20, in fact, softer than the global price that they're getting in Europe and the Middle East. And in fact, it's even lower here in Canada, where our producers are discounted even more for transportation into the U.S., and our oil tends to be a little heavier, needing a little more refining and upgrading. So in fact, Alberta producers are not really seeing wildly high prices in 2011 or 2012. And that's why if you hold some of these energy company stocks in your portfolio, or if you track these, their stock performance has been kind of disappointing. As costs are rising, prices are only kind of mediocre. Now, it's still an acceptable price range. They're still making money. They're still out there drilling. We haven't heard a lot of reports about oil sand projects being postponed or not too many downscales, and I don't think we will. I think prices in 2013 will remain in an acceptable range for Alberta producers, probably around $80 to $95. There's always going to be volatility, you know, and problems in the Middle East that could sort of increase the level of volatility, these prices moving up and down. But I think 2013 will be another okay year for energy prices, and it will leave Alberta producers in reasonably good shape. Another industry I want to talk about in Alberta, and one that tends to get forgotten a little bit, at least in Edmonton and Calgary, places like Spruce Grove, and certainly when I talk in Lethbridge and Stettler and Peace River, they do not for a second forget about agriculture, and they know what an important driver agriculture still is of the provincial economy. The good news is that 2012 is on track to be the record-setting year for agriculture, for farm cash receipts. And that's really good news. Those oil and grain and oilseed prices are high. Livestock prices, hog prices are uneven, but cattle prices are solid. So there's a lot of farm cash income. We're on track to set a new record in 2012. Now, any self-respecting farmer will come up to me afterwards and point out, in no uncertain terms, that input costs are still crushing them. You know, so it's not all roses and sunshine. And it's true, input costs are squeezing some margins. But nonetheless, farm income and agriculture in general is one of the leading sectors of the provincial economy at the moment. And I think that will continue into 2013 as we see still solid forecasts for grain and oilseed prices. Cattle prices, now that we're finished with this E. coli situation, and I've insisted on calling it a situation, not a crisis. I always think that word crisis was not an appropriate word to be used around the E. coli and the XL situation. But now that we're through that, I think Canadian cattle and Alberta ranchers, their reputation will be left intact, and I don't think they will face any sort of long-term damage or reputational damage. And I think 2013 will be a good year for livestock. Finally, retail activity. How are Alberta shoppers feeling these days? Well, if you judge by Statistics Canada, they put out monthly numbers on retail sales. Judging by those reports, Alberta shoppers are through the roof with enthusiasm. They can hardly be contained. They're so happy being out there shopping. July and August were record-setting months, and after August's record-setting months, I fully expected when September numbers to come out. I thought they would be down a little bit. Usually you see things bounce up and down a little bit. But no, September numbers came out and they shot through the roof. They were even much higher than August. Now, what is leading to all this euphoria for shopping in Alberta? Well, the main driver is the labor market. We've got 4.5% unemployment. We've got the highest wages in the country, and higher, by the way, about 20% higher than the national average. People in Alberta are earning a lot of money, and they're out enjoying it. They're out spending. There are some demographic factors too. We have a younger population in Alberta than the Canadian average, and younger people, especially young families, tend to spend more than people later in life. So there's some demographic reasons, but it's largely to do with the labor market and high and rising wages. Now, I do expect these retail numbers to kind of moderate, maybe in the third quarter, the fourth quarter of 2012, and certainly moderate a bit into 2013. I think they'll come off their peaks, not because of anything bad happening in the provincial economy, more just because of what economists call consumer fatigue or consumer saturation. In other words, you only need to buy so many washing machines, or need to buy so many hockey skates, or need to buy so many handbags. Although I was corrected on that. I was actually told handbags, that doesn't apply. Shoes and handbags are a separate category. They don't apply. But most other things we buy, you only need so many of them. This lady here is laughing. She knows, right?
She was telling me she has no fatigue whatsoever.
No fatigue. Well, she's going to keep those retail sales rolling, I can tell. But most other things we buy, other than shoes and handbags, you only need so much of them, and I think we will see these numbers kind of moderate in 2013. So where does this leave Alberta's, well, if this is what the global economy looked like in 2007, nice and juicy, and this is kind of what it looks like today. This is, this is what our little hamburger looked like after we mashed it apart with the wooden pick. It's not pretty. I got to tell you, it still tastes good, but it was not a pretty sight at all. I think the global economy in 2013 will not really be a pretty picture. I think there will remain a lot of very anxious news out of Europe, a lot of anxiety about the state of Europe's financial markets and banks. I think the US economy, hopefully we'll see some progress, but still a bit sluggish there. And also some fears about slowdowns in Asia. Asia, by the way, right now they're the only leg of the stool that's really operating well, and we are seeing a slowdown there, and that could lead to some anxious moments too. So the global economy, I think, will be a bit of a not pretty picture in 2013. But Alberta, it is different. So what is most likely this fall and 2013 for Alberta? Well, the global economy, as I just mentioned, is slowing. We're seeing some moderation there. Oil prices will remain volatile, but I think they will remain in a price range that's at least favorable, or at least okay for Alberta producers. And Alberta economy is moderating. Now that's actually good news. Last year in 2011 we saw a growth rate of 5.1%. That's getting actually pretty close to Chinese levels of growth. And faster is not always better. If you're Greece or Ohio or California, faster is definitely better. They need some there. But Alberta, we actually needed our economy to slow down a little bit. Just a nice moderation. And that is what we're seeing in 2012. We're going from 5.1% last year to probably something close to 3.5% growth in 2012. That's a nice balanced economy. Not too fast, not too cold. It's kind of Goldilocks. And I think we'll see that same level of moderate but healthy growth in 2013. Alberta's economy is moderating, but it remains very stable. Now, you've got to look pretty hard in the industrialized world to find an economy that is as stable and balanced as Alberta and our sidekick Saskatchewan. You've got a nice balanced labor market. You've got the housing and residential market in good shape. It's pretty hard to beat that, and I think in 2013 will be another very favorable year, as long as these energy and commodity prices hold in there. So with that, I will stop talking. I've only left about 5 minutes, hoping to leave a little bit more, but I've got about 5 minutes if you do have any questions. Oh, this
Todd,
yes.
I'll stay away from the marijuana question. Thank you for your presentation. It's always great to listen to you. You speak very clearly and make it easy for, I think, everyone to understand economics. But do you see a disconnect between what we have the finance minister saying overall credit is too high, and then on the other hand, are trying to grow our economy, where people, to me, that there's a disconnect there. Is he saying it just to try to keep things regulated, or what?
Well, it is a tricky spot that both, the government of Canada and our finance minister, Mr. Flaherty, and the Bank of Canada, both of them have been sort of, wagging their fingers and saying, Canadians are taking on too much debt. But at the same time, they keep interest rates at almost zero, which really encourages more borrowing. It is kind of a problem for them. But when they do the finger wagging, they can't really say this, but they're speaking to one segment of the population, and that is people who are taking on too much debt. For probably 80 or 90% of Canadian households, their debt levels are okay. But it is that 10 or 20%, and not to stereotype, but a lot of them tend to be young people. Young families, maybe looking at buying homes. A lot of them have taken on inappropriate levels of debt, and those are the ones who are going to be in trouble, not everyone else. The low interest rates are actually for everybody else, especially companies who might be in really, really good shape, and now would be the time to borrow, perhaps, and to invest. But there's two groups of people, but they have to send out.
Just a quick add-on, is that company debt included in that overall
No,
debt that they're...
no. That debt to GDP ratio that everyone's worried about, that's just household debt. Canadian companies are in great shape, generally. At the back, yeah.
Just a quick question about Prime Minister Harper's recent trip to India. Was that more a political show, or is there legitimacy in his notion that we could double trade with India in the next 3 years? And what would be some of the barriers to doing that? And do you really see a decoupling of our economy from the U.S. economy in the next generation?
Yeah, well, a lot of questions in there. Well, I guess anything.
Quick one. I didn't say anything.
Well, anything a politician does, and I don't say this cynically, but anything a politician does is, there's some showmanship around it. Mr. Harper has been pretty careful to to make a show that he is expanding some business and some trade linkages with Asia. I think he needs to be doing that. He's done it with China. Now he wants to be doing it with India. Yeah, we could possibly double our trade with India. The problem with doing business with India is that it takes a lot more work than doing business with the United States. U.S., we're dealing with similar language, similar business customs, similar kind of legal system. Everything is very, very familiar, even the time zone. You know, doing business with India, there's enormous possibilities and potential, but it really takes a lot of work. And I don't know if Canadians understand that yet, but I think we need to, not only the Prime Minister, but the Canadian businesses need to do some homework in that. Yes?
I'm interested in two comments from you regarding the Bank of Canada change this week.
Yeah.
So how will that, what Carney's leaving, impact Canada, and how will Carney's leaving impact England?
Oh yeah, so Mr. Carney, of course, sad news, he's been poached from the Bank of Canada by the Bank of England. Well, in some ways, I mean, it's bittersweet. It's sad in a way that Canada's losing a real rock star like Mark Carney. The good news is he's not just going off to sit on a beach somewhere. He's taking over one of the largest and most influential central banks in the world. And even though he will be making decisions for the UK, it doesn't hurt at all that that man will, Canada will still kind of be top of his mind. He will understand how Canada is increasingly taking a larger role in the global economy. So that actually, it works to Canada's advantage. It also gives Canada some cachet. He's the first foreigner ever to be appointed as the governor of the Bank of England. And the fact that he's Canadian, I think speaks really highly of Canada and how our profile is rising. Who's going to step into his shoes? That's a big question. We were chatting at our table about that. There's speculation that Tiff Macklem, who is right now one of the governors, he's not the senior governor, but he's on governing council. If that happens, he's a very, very bright man, and I think he's kind of cut from the same cloth as Mark Carney. In other words, I used to work for, well, he was my boss's boss when I was at the Bank of Canada, but he's wickedly smart with the numbers. He understands central banking. He can speak to financiers, but he can also communicate very well to non-economists, and that was Mark Carney's talent. And I think Tiff would have the same sort of credentials. So if they appoint him, I think we're in good shape. Other appointments, I don't know. There's probably all kinds of people who would do a good job too. Yes?
Your prediction on the pipelines? West Coast?
Oh.
South? Gold?
I think the Keystone XL, if I have to put percentages to it, I think the Keystone XL is probably at 90% will go ahead. I think the Northern Gateway is about 10%.
10%.
I actually, if I had to put any money on it, I would say that pipeline will not be approved, at least not in its current form. And the reason, again, we were chatting at lunch, the reason is the whole discussion has gone anywhere beyond economics and finance. It's all political. And once political types dig their heels in and we see a change of government in BC, there's almost no arguing or no debating or no convincing that will bring about a change. So I'm not very optimistic actually about Northern Gateway. Yes, sir.
I'm reading in the paper about the U.S. becoming self-sufficient in oil and gas over the next 4 years or so.
Yeah.
How is that going to impact us here in Alberta?
Well, it's a really great question, and you're referring to that International Energy Agency, the Paris-based organization. The way they did their report, and it is a bit unclear if Canadian oil, if they're sort of including, Canada's sort of part of the States, isn't it? They may, in fact, be including Canadian oil in part of that self-sufficiency notion. But even if they're not, the way they did their little forecast was they said, well, let's see, over the last 2 years, U.S. output of oil has increased quite a bit. So let's just take a ruler and draw a straight line to the year 2020. And they said, at current rates of production, this is where they're going to end up. Well, I don't know much about forecasting, but anyone who forecasts with a straight line, extrapolating with a ruler, that never is going to work. They might be right, and the U.S. might be. I wouldn't want to say they're dead wrong, but I would say, well, there's a lot that can happen between now and 2020 that could throw their straight line forecasting kind of out of whack. I don't think the report is anything we need to panic about. But I do think a report like that is good to come around every now and then, because Albertans need to keep their eyes open. That could in fact be the outcome, and we have to understand our province is in a different shape, or a different situation, if we don't in fact have some alternatives. Or maybe selling our products to other buyers, or developing new products and new markets altogether. All right, Rotarians want to run on time, so I'm getting the whip here. So thank you very much for having me in.